Hello there. I'm Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, and I want to welcome you to a special conversation with award-winning director Ron Howard and best-selling author J.D. Vance. They're joining us to discuss how they turned J.D.'s best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, to a new film. We have a close connection to both of our guests. J.D. has spoken about his book here at the Library of Congress on several occasions, including the National Book Festival. And the library also has a large collection of holdings connected to Ron Howard, from the Andy Griffin Show to A Beautiful Mind. Hillbilly Elegy starts streaming on Netflix on Tuesday, November 24th. Joining us now is Scott Stuber, Vice President of Original Film at Netflix.
Hi, I'm Scott Stuber, Head of Film at Netflix. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this special Hillbilly Elegy conversation. I want to offer special thanks to Dr. Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, for hosting and moderating this conversation, and to the library staff for making the event possible. J.D. Vance's powerful memoir offers a window into one family's personal journey of survival and triumph. Following three colorful generations through their unique struggles, his story explores the highs and lows that defined his family experience. I was a big fan of the book, and when legendary director Ron Howard brought us the opportunity to make it into a film, our whole team immediately said yes. Ron assembled a female-led crew and an unbelievable cast led by Amy Adams and Glenn Close to help bring J.D.'s words to life on the screen. From the beginning, Ron wanted to tell the story of the incredible women that helped raise J.D. and the power of family, and he made an empathetic, beautiful story that we are all very proud of. With the celebration of Thanksgiving later this week in the U.S., we think this film will offer audiences the message of hope and healing. After a year like 2020, it's something we all need at this time. Tomorrow, we look forward to bringing the film Hillbilly Elegy to our members in over 190 countries around the world. But tonight, in partnership with the Library of Congress, we bring you this important discussion between author J.D. Vance and director Ron Howard and a clip from the film. Enjoy, and thank you again to the library and Dr. Hayden, and an early happy Thanksgiving to you and your families.
Thank you, Scott. Our two special guests need no introduction, and we have a lot to cover. I'm honored to welcome Academy Award-winning director Ron Howard and best-selling author J.D. Vance. And I want to thank you both, and I was just proudly holding up my autographed copy of Hillbilly Elegy, and also the career in the Library of Congress holdings of Mr. Howard, pages and
single
pages
space.
and
That's
pages
all single
and
space.
pages, starting from 1958, and also the holdings of your brother Clint. So the connection here, because I got my copy of the book at the National Book Festival, where J.D. was one of the authors that had people lining up all around the convention center. And so the thought that now the book is being brought to the screen and starts streaming on November 24th is really exciting. So I'd like to just start by asking both of you, what was it like working together to bring a #1 bestseller to the screen?
Well, we probably have different sides of this, because I've had experience with telling people's, story before, whether scripted or now, actively in the last few years in the documentary format. So for me, it's a question of finding the movie story within it. And for that, it was a function of not only reading and rereading the book, but also actually doing an even deeper dive, particularly in the areas that I saw within the book that to me suggested a movie, because it didn't immediately suggest a story structure, but within it, I began to see what I thought was a really interesting, powerful, and emotional family drama that would still capture, many of the specifics that J.D. writes about in the book on a sociological level, but the drama, the heartbeat of it would be, the story of the way this family is tested and the way J.D. was tested. So JD seemed a little reluctant at first.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was, when the book really took off, there was this period where, it felt like every film producer was interested in making a movie out of it. And I felt pretty apprehensive about it because, one, I'm not a movie maker, and I knew that if somebody else made it into a movie, then I would lose control. Whereas, the book was mine and I had control over what went in it. But I was also just, worried about how you could possibly capture my family, my mama, especially in a way that was respectful and was honest and was true. And so, I definitely, most of the folks who came knocking, I didn't even talk to. And I remember, the first conversation I had with Ron pretty distinctly, because it was a week or two before my wife gave birth to our first child. And he walked me through sort of his high level vision for the project. And I thought, this is a guy who actually gets it, who sort of understands what I was trying to convey and what I was trying to do. And so maybe we should give this a shot. And that sort of, one thing led to another, and here we are.
And to portray the culture and the experience of Appalachia on the screen must have felt like an enormous challenge. And what influenced your vision, Ron, and then JD, how did you feel about that aspect being portrayed?
Well, it's always a challenge when you're going to take on real events and real people, but it's a not so distant past. And, our research really began with getting together with JD, and Usha came along, as did the newborn, right?
Yeah,
as I recall. And along with our writer and producing team. And, we went to Jackson, Kentucky. We went to Middletown. We spent a couple of days talking to JD about it. And so, we didn't have to make any of this stuff up. I mean, there were photos of what the family looked like. There were home videos that gave us access and insight. As far as research goes, all you have to do is drive around a little bit, and you understand what aspects of this community looks like, feels like, sounds like today. So then the task was, how do we do that in an efficient way when our story is really just focused on this family? I mean, it's not it's not trying to be a definitive account of a culture. It's what lessons can we learn from this family? How can this family engross us and move us, and what can we get from it?
Yeah, I think there's a classic editor's trope that you're always trying to show and not tell. It's one thing to say, this is what Mamaw sounded like and acted like. It's another thing to actually tell a story, or to give people a sense of what she was like through a more immersive experience. And I think that, one of the things I appreciate about Ron's approach is that he would take stories from the book and find some way to put them in a way that was more atmospheric. And so it wasn't, these people think this, they act like this, they talk like this. He was actually sort of showing you the people and trying to give you a sense of what they actually acted like. And, one of the things that, we really just as a family really admired about the way that they went about it. And I think in some ways we'll always sort of have this now. I mean, obviously it's out there, and so we will always have it, is that they really tried to recreate Mamaw's, not just what she looked like, which they did well, but little things that I didn't appreciate how much of a real art there was to performance. The way that she held a cigarette, the way that the glasses sat on her face, the way that she sort of, you would get this kind of like, twitch in her face when she was annoyed or frustrated about something. These little things that they were interviewing us about, trying to get a sense of what the characters were like. I didn't realize how effectively they would be able to sort of, put that on the screen. And so where I feel like the movie is most successful is where it takes some of those real people and just gives them a sense, gives the audience a sense of who they are.
Is that what drew you to Glenn Close and Amy Adams? Because it is almost uncanny when you see the transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I had worked with Glenn before, and I'd long wanted to work with Amy. So I was, I was very excited when they came on board, Glenn is a kind of a chameleon and a real artist. And while I don't think she had any direct correlation to the Mamaw character in terms of any relationships in her life that were just like that experience, she is like a sponge. And she appreciated talking to JD. She appreciated reading everything she could read and looking at the videos, but also talking to other family members who weren't even a part of our story because they weren't central at that point, at the periods of time that we were focusing on, the crisis points that we were dramatizing. But Glenn learned, a lot from, JD has a cousin who just very, kind of vividly can really imitate Mamaw and really understood Mamaw and loved her. And that conversation was important. Now for Amy, she was drawing on some personal stuff, and I honestly still to this day don't know quite what it was, but she made a connection. And so, yes, she met JD's mom. Yes, she met the family, but there was also something else going on there with her as an artist that she was drawing upon to create this, this damaged, but also very, very loving person who made mistakes, but yet undeniably would lay her life down for her kids. And so that's a real paradoxical kind of a character. And I thought Amy brought her to the screen with a lot of truth, but also humanity.
And JD, the most compelling scenes in the book, did you feel that they were being included in the film? And how did you work with Ron in making sure that those scenes that grip you in the book, and I know many in here?
Yeah, what I tried to do is just be an advisor to the project as much as I could and try to, take little pieces of dialogue and say, this sounds right, this doesn't sound right, to try to encourage Ron to, focus on things that I thought were really important. But obviously, in a 2-hour movie, you're not going to have every scene that we necessarily want as a family in the book. And, there's a fair amount of artistic license, of course, that you have to sort of take to make the story fit together, which, we were all totally fine with that. I would say the weirdest scenes for us to watch as a family, certainly for me to watch personally, were the ones where, it was like 95% accurate to how it was in our memory. So, the scene where Mamaw dies is so close, but I'm wearing something different in the real scene than I am in that brief scene where they show Mamaw dying. And so it does, I think, convey the importance of what that meant to us as a family. But it's also, when you're actually watching as a person who experienced these things, you sort of have this out-of-body experience of sort of recognizing that there's this memory on the big screen that's like 5% off, but 95% on. And it's just very hard to convey how unusual that is. To answer your question, I do think that there were some really critical scenes from the book that Ron, put in the movie. One of them that was important to me was, when Papaw, is my grandfather, has his funeral, and we're sort of snaking through these hills and hollers on the way to his funeral. And, people get out of their car and they stop their cars and get out of their cars, and they put their hands over their hearts and they take their hats off. And there's just this way in which, when somebody dies in that region of the country, you are respectful about it, and you stop whatever you're doing and you try to pay proper respect to the person who has died. And I think that's so unusual because the world is so fast paced. And I even, you see a funeral motorcade go by in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is, a big but not a huge city, and you very rarely see people actually pull over and stop. They're trying to get over, they're trying to get in front of the motorcade so they're not slowed down. And I do think that just conveys something important about the group of people that I came from, about how they were willing to actually take some time out of their day and pay homage to somebody who had just passed away. That was an important scene to me. And there are a lot of scenes like that where I think you get something bigger and more important about the book through the movie, even though it's obviously in a very condensed and unique way.
Ron, to have 2 hours or that to try to take a book that has so many scenes, parts, and people, how do you?
Well, it's challenging. And Vanessa Taylor and I spent a lot of time, along with Karen Lunder, who runs movies at Imagine Entertainment, and is also a producer on the film. I mean, literally days and days and days poring over it, thinking about it, putting scenes up on cards on a wall, looking at it, moving things around, because you do know that there's a limited amount of time. But ultimately, again, I didn't feel the burden of responsibility to try to, to make this into a polemic or try to be sociologically, comprehensive. I really was interested in this as this specific family drama. And yes, it's a kind of a test. It's a test of a family and a test of J.D. About how one family navigated the, economic hardships, generational trauma, addiction, abuse, these cycles of dysfunction, and yet came out on the other side in a healthier and more constructive place. And how that can happen. Just as an example, this is one circumstance, and to me, the one takeaway is that you as an individual can have made many, many missteps that you regret deeply, but it's never too late to make that decision, to make that choice, that gesture, that leadership that can really help reshape and define the future of somebody that you care about. You say family, but it could be a neighbor. It could be somebody you don't even know. But making those kinds of sacrifices, which J.D. experienced in his journeys, both as a younger man and then again as an older man. And I wanted to build the tension and the suspense around how that was going to happen.
And it was very successful because even someone who's read the book, the film drew you in, even though you knew how it was going to end, in a sense. But, and that's really something when you take a book that is well loved and transfer it into another experience, but you still have a satisfying experience. Now, J.D., I'd really like to hear about how your family, you mentioned some of the viewings that you've had, how they really felt.
Yeah, it was tough in a lot of ways to watch the movie together, but it was ultimately a good thing. And I think for many of the same reasons why the book, though tough, and it caused a lot of tough conversations. It wasn't always easy, but it was sort of necessary because I think it forced us to actually reckon with some of the things that we'd maybe assumed and maybe thought and felt, but we never actually talked about as a family. And so, one of the things that it's just crazy, but we had never actually talked about was the way in which some of the most traumatic moments of our own lives had been replayed and replicated in generations prior. That, I grew up thinking of my papa as this complete saint, this perfect man who could do no wrong. But then you realize that in his youth, he was an alcoholic, and he had in fact exposed his family to some pretty tough circumstances, with a very loving father, but also a man who had a lot of challenges and, put his family through a lot of real problems. And, the effect that had, I think for all of us, is it sort of humanized us a little bit. There's always this kind of guilt or this feeling that maybe you don't belong, or maybe, there's something just wrong with you. There's something wrong with your people, that these things keep on happening. But when you sort of put them in a wider context, it's a little bit easier to understand both where the people who maybe you felt some resentment towards are coming from, and also better able to understand your own action and your own conduct in that way. But the viewings were pretty intense. Some of the scenes that were taken from the book and taken from all of our lives, there's just no way around it. There were a lot of tears. There were certainly a lot of tough conversations. There were things that I maybe didn't expect to be so difficult that were. I keep talking about the scene where Papal died, and maybe for obvious reasons in hindsight that was going to be very emotional, but going into it, it's like this memory that you have, and it was a sad time and it was a terrible moment, but when you actually see it and other people acting out on it, it was just much, much more difficult. And I think led to a lot of really interesting conversations about Papal that we had never had before, just because the emotions are so intense and people are crying and hugging and, thinking about what that particular moment meant to their lives. So I guess to summarize, it's tough, but ultimately from the family's perspective, I think we all gain something from it.
And I hope that the movie version of the book can be cathartic in certainly lesser ways, but useful ways for people. I mean, that's part of what makes storytelling so human and so important to us, is that it creates empathy, it creates catharsis, it throws up a mirror and suggests that we should look at it. And again, even though JD's family is sort of culturally specific, one of the things that I really valued about this opportunity was I felt how broadly relatable so many of these twists and turns, these decisions, these difficulties and challenges, so many other people had felt and had been through. And I witnessed it in making the film, because you do the first take of one of these powerhouse scenes, one of these turning points in JD's life, and you walk off the set and away from the camera, and you could literally hear crew people relating to it and talking about it, and it was cathartic for them. It brought up memories. And JD, as you're saying, when people think about these things and talk about them, and they're not just in the hamster wheel of life, just churning. Sometimes I think it's pretty valuable. I hope that our movie lends itself to some of that.
Well, I can testify to that. I watched it with my 89-year-old mother, and who had read the book and loved the book and sat there. And as soon as it was over, she turned to me and she said, "I'm Mima," to Taylor, her grandson. And then we talked about the similarities and all of those things. So yes, that family story and choices.
Well, at the end, I mean, look, it's sort of sounds a little formulaic or something. I don't mean it to. It is kind of the story of the power of love, because you make these choices, out of love. You might have made some horrible mistakes, and nobody's immune from that. But these other moments where that expression of love is activated, that's that means so much toward not only repairing but moving forward in really constructive ways, the kinds of ways that we all want to.
And JD, that kind of love that manifests itself in what we might call tough love seemed to be quite a thread.
Yeah, that definitely was part of Mamaw's personality, is that she loved very powerfully and profoundly, but she also was going to give it to you straight. And I think that came from a recognition that sometimes the hardest truths just need to be said and they need to be reinforced. And one of the ways to do that is just to be very, very firm and very direct. And so, one of the things that pretty consistently I heard as a teenager, and even after Mamaw passed, from my aunt, from my sister, from my mom, is Mamaw was just very hard on you. She was very hard on you. And I never really thought that in the moment. Like, I never woke up and thought, Mamaw's just, she's too mean. She's too direct. She's riding me a little bit too hard. I just sort of thought that was her way. And I kind of realized now, both from writing the book and talking to people about it, that was sort of her way of trying to ensure that I didn't fall through the cracks. She sort of recognized that a lot of these things that I wrote about, where I was in a pretty precarious moment as a young teenager, she really wanted to steer me away from those things. And if she had to cuss a little bit and she had to get pretty stern, she was more than willing to do it.
And definitely there were scenes that illustrated that you were having a few moments with the tearing up things, being influenced by bad kids. And that
Yeah, you know
Ron.
those were some of the more interesting scenes of the movie to me, because when Ron and I were talking about these scenes a year or two ago, just because it's so important to create this moment of dramatic effect, he's sort of asking, well, what were the most precarious moments of yours when you were a teenager, when you were a kid? What were the moments where you were clearly at a fork in the road in life and you could have gone one direction or the other? And, in my mind, I always felt bad because I didn't think that I answered those questions especially well, because it was just, my childhood. And I didn't at the moment, obviously, think to myself, well, if I start smoking weed and doing drugs with this crowd versus doing this other thing that Mamaw's telling me to do, maybe things wouldn't have gone so well for me. But you do, in hindsight, realize that there were really these critical moments of my childhood where if Mamaw hadn't stepped in, so many of the things that I take for granted now just wouldn't have happened. And I think, one of the things I really, really, really appreciated about the movie, because I think it's something some people sometimes miss about the book, is, people define success in different ways, obviously. And the way that I'd always defined success as a child, was not going to a nice law school or getting a good job or having a lot of money. If there was a material component at all, it was having a good enough job that you could put food on the table. But it was mostly just having a happy, successful, stable family. It was having a wife and a few kids, and being able to provide for those people, not just in a material way, but in sort of where the kids knew who their mom and dad were. The kids knew that they were going to have a happy and normal life, and they weren't worried about, if they were going to be moving 6 months down the road, or if they were going to be living with somebody else in 6 months. And that sense of family stability is obviously how I sort of think about success, at least to me. And I appreciated that the sort of the critical thing almost in the movie is whether this kid goes back to his girlfriend. It's built around this, this question of whether he ultimately gets this job, but it's really the sort of the central theme of whether he ends up doing well. I like that it's built around Usha, the girlfriend, who of course is now my wife, and we've got 2 kids together. And that sense of family being at the center of it, defined one way in Middletown, defined in a new way when you're thinking about starting a new life with somebody else. I really appreciated that, because I do think that many people, when they think of success, they think of money and a good job. They don't really think about the things that a lot of us don't take for granted, which is just having a happy family life.
Well, there were a couple of things that J.D. said early on that meant, well, no, one thing he said, and the other thing I observed, I should say. But the thing that he said was how vitally important the women were in his life, key women, including his sister Lindsay, certainly Mamaw, Usha, but also Bev in her own ways, disruptive in certain ways, and yet, at key moments, supportive and imbuing a great intelligence and curiosity and intellect to him. So I really wanted to convey that in the film. The other thing was just something that I observed, which I really appreciate, which is, look, every family has some baggage. Every family is burdened and blessed with a kind of history that suggests strength of character, but also, generational dysfunction, as I was saying earlier. And some people who are ambitious, morally ambitious on a career level, whatever it might be, whatever's driving them, they make that move, they break away, they do it. But it's not about just getting out of town for JD. A lot of people leave and don't look back. And what I could see in JD was a guy who very sincerely believed that both important possibilities could exist in his life, a deep connection with his family, his heritage, his history, and the people he loved and he grew up with, and still a kind of, intellectual and career progress that could give him and his family another level of security, satisfy his own curiosity and ambition, and he's doing it. And it's very hard work. It's very hard work to do that, and it's what I see over and over again. And I hope that found its way into the film in some way, at least the seeds of that, because when this film ends, I feel like that the real it depicts a moment where the real J.D. was beginning to be the J.D. that we know now, who could write a book about his family, could finish school, could build a career, could marry the right woman.
And the possibilities. And before we end, I have to ask about the effect of the pandemic as the film was nearing the end of production and how that did.
Well, we fortunately, it didn't affect us too much. We finished our filming right under the wire, literally the day that the industry shut down on March 13th, and we were completed, and so we did have to edit remotely. I spent a couple of days in the final mix and color timing and things like that, where I had to go into New York City. But we were in great shape. We had already screened the movie quite a bit, and as we continued to sort of do our test screenings and make our editorial refinements, I did feel that as COVID took hold, in some ways the movie was even more cathartic for some reason. I don't really know why, and I haven't had time to think about it, but it seems to pack even a little bit more of an emotional punch. I think it stirs feelings. I think it stirs controversial feelings. And as J.D. said earlier, I hope it stirs some healthy conversation.
And before we go, we have a special treat for everyone. We have a sneak peek of the movie. So here's a clip.
Okay.
Why do they do that, Mamaw?
'Cause we're hill people, honey. We respect our dead.
I didn't know till after he was gone how Papa had protected my mom from the world. Now the only person who ever got her was gone. Whatever dreams she or any of us had, they all just seemed that much further away.
This book will be reread, and there will be so many people, Mr. Howard, who are grateful that you have brought it to the screen so we can all share with our families. Thank you both.
Thank you for those kind words. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Carla.
Hillbilly Elegy starts streaming on Netflix on November 24th.